Good afternoon and welcome. This is the third and final day of the Forum for the Future of Culture. Today we have two debates. The next one will be at 5:30, and there will be a presentation by the Culture section of the Advisory Board of the Nationwide Women's Strike. This debate will be moderated by Janka Świerżewska. It's called Before the Climate Disaster, Stories from a New World.
Dzień dobry wszystkim.
Good afternoon.
Tylko taka mała może rzecz.
Just one little thing that I wanted to say before we begin. We're all at home and it's possible that my dog might bark at some point, but I hope that won't be a problem. So, welcome to this debate, which we've called Before the Climate Disaster, Stories from a New World. I believe that it's time for a new narrative, a new story about the world. The way we think about the climate crisis is focusing on the years 2030 and 2050 as boundary points. We're talking about how to prevent the disaster, but not about how to rebuild the world. I think we need this history to be intersectional. The term intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, takes note of those who are marginalized in various parts of their identity. So we're facing various questions and various answers. And I wanted to focus today on storytelling, on new narratives, and the way they connect with a utopian world. What will happen after 2050? Can we opt for another way forward? What possibilities do we have? And how can utopian thinking be translated into action? I have four guests today, whom I will introduce. Before we move on to the questions, we have Aleksandra Jach, a curator, educator, art historian. She's the author of exhibitions, publications, conferences, research projects, and festivals. For many years, she's worked at Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź. She's now in the Culture for Climate Collective with Ewa Chomicka, Anna Czaban, Aleksandra Janus, Iza Kaszyńska, Magdalena Klepczarek, Magdalena Komornicka, Joanna Nuckowska, and Maria Wilska. We also have Marek Beylin, who has a background in art history. He's a writer, journalist who writes for Gazeta Wyborcza and Krytyka Polityczna. He writes about politics, social problems, democracy, and culture. Anna Zachorowska-Mazurkiewicz is an economist. She has a postdoc in economy, a professor at the Institute of Economics and Management at Jagiellonian University. She's in the Feminist think tank and specializes in institutional and feminist economics. And we have Filip Springer, reporter, photographer. He's written books about public space and architecture, works with the Instytut Reportażu, and with Julia Fiedorczuk. He founded the first Polish school of Ecopoetics. My name is Janka Świerżewska. I'm an environmental activist, and I'll be moderating this debate. My first question goes out to Marek. Is the struggle and what we're doing today, is it coping with the climate crisis? And if not, or if it is only to some extent, how can we change that by learning from others and from history? Good afternoon. I'll try to be brief. Of course not. We know that the struggle, the effort, the protest today is not enough because we are where we are. We're on the verge of climate crisis. We're on the verge of disaster. But what is happening is a good starting point to address or prevent the disaster. I think that, first of all, we need to say that our struggle to save the planet has to be a struggle to save democracy as well, and that's not self-evident. Because that's not a foregone conclusion, because we're looking at a very expensive, something we might call the Chinese model, authoritarian capitalism. a very expansive oligarchy that is very, for various governments and politicians, it's very appealing. But I'm not sure that it's worth saving the planet this way by pushing people into another hell, the hell of a political regime. So for me, saving the climate has to do with saving democracy. They're related. And saving democracy is a precondition if we are to save the planet. Now let's get back to what's happening and how can, and let's take a look at what might come next. What we're seeing at the moment is anger, the anger of bodies, individuals in the street, the anger expressed in words, words spoken in the street, in the media, in social media. And this is great. This anger, expressed in different ways, is necessary for any change to begin, but it's not sufficient, it's not enough. And let me just say that when it comes to angry words, I was looking for different expressions of this anger manifestation, and in culture, I think the most interesting artist who's trying to express this anger also in the spirit of solidarity is Shitsa, Alex Freiheit, whom I really recommend looking into as a herald of expression that's rooted in solidarity and also anger. But anger is not enough, and what I'm going to say might sound like a cliche, but if you expand on it, it won't be a cliche. Anger must be complemented by solidarity. Of course, it's very easy to talk about solidarity, but it's much more difficult to practice. And again, based on history and also on the present, what solidarity can be, especially solidarity within feminist movements, or as defined by feminist movements, because women's movements in the past and now have, I believe, the greatest potential to carry this message of equality and emancipation. I want to get back to the classic manifesto by Bell Hooks from 1984, in which, for the first time in such a clear way, the issue of dealing with the three types of discrimination: gender discrimination, racial and economic discrimination. So, and we're still there. We still haven't resolved that. These three types of discrimination are constraining our world, are constraining us, and are stopping any change. This type of solidarity, as expressed, as defined by Bell Hooks, I think can be a signpost that we ought to follow and, of course, depart in various ways by developing that. I think that one fruit or outcome, perhaps, of that black feminism is the Black Lives Matter movement, and definitely activists and politicians in the U.S. like Aleksandra Ocasio-Cortez. In Poland, we have similar progressive women who are in politics, who are making their presence felt, not just in the Polish parliament, but they're trying to change reality as well. So that's one kind of solidarity. There's another solidarity I wanted to mention and quote a specific example. I'm thinking about a conversation I had a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, with Joanna Pawluściewicz, who at the time was an activist for the Białowieża forest. She told me about the camp they set up, the oppression they faced. It was a collective community of very diverse people coming from different backgrounds, which is obvious. She spoke about solidarity. She said she doesn't agree that when the maligned environmental minister died, Jan Szyszko, part of the people supporting them were very happy. So the public sphere, there was a lot of resentment or people who said that they were happy celebrating that minister's death, but we were taught not to do that. However, she quotes another example taken from personal experience. At some point, a forest ranger, roughed her up, and she said that she felt solidarity with that person because there are foresters, there are rangers who want the forest to survive and grow, but she also sees, because she knows that these people are economically vulnerable, so she can imagine organizing a strike to support forest rangers and give them better working conditions. So that's an example of tough, difficult solidarity, non-rhetorical, to show solidarity, to express solidarity with people who are persecuting you, who are harassing you. And that shows the great potential of solidarity that I think it's worth developing. There's another thing that solidarity can teach us, and it's also something that the discussion about non-binary identities is also teaching us, non-binary gender identities, but this can also be expanded to include interpretations of the world, because solidarity is non-binary. It's not an either-or. It doesn't address one group and exclude another. Solidarity, ever since Hannah Arendt and Judith Butler, it stems from the sense that we're all responsible for one another. We're all in this together, because as a planet, as humanity, we all depend on one another, rely on one another, and the category of and binary categories don't apply, because binary categories lead to domination, hierarchy, and exclusion. And finally, there's a fourth general dimension of solidarity. If we're to do something about the climate, then we need solidarity that goes beyond the boundaries of our bubble, of Poland, of Europe, or the European Union, because if Europe remains alone, or if the West remains isolated in its struggle to save the climate, then it won't be any use and won't lead anywhere. We need to think of global solidarity, a solidarity modeled on the idea that accompanied the creation of the European Union. So it's been halted, it's experiencing crisis, but it's an important idea. So a process of federalization, jointly making decisions, but I don't want to hog this discussion, and it has to do with the need for a revolution, but a revolution that would be done using small steps, as all true revolutions were, to delegate political responsibility to citizens. But that's it for the time being. Thank you for that introduction. We will be getting back to solidarity. I will ask about it in the second round of questions. Now I want to ask about perhaps slightly more specific examples of action and activism. My first question goes out to Aleksandra Jach. How can culture affect the climate, and what is the connection, and how does that determine what we do? Thank you for this planetary scale question, since I don't feel at home in such a dimension, talking about big pictures. I'll say what I've been doing for the past year. And I think you've partly expressed that when introducing me. You listed all the names of the people in the Culture for Climate Collective. I appreciate that. It was very important for me. Thank you. And that's the most important initiative I'm currently involved in. For the past 6 months, we've been working on a website that will be a collection of best practice, environmentally friendly institutions, organizations. You'll be able to sign a declaration. People of culture or the cultural community, culture workers, will be able to express their support for sustainable institutions, and we want to change the whole realm of culture because that's the long-term goal. Why am I saying this? I spent 10 years working in culture, and for a long time I've also been interested in the environment, looking at what people have been doing, and it's very interesting substantively. But at one point, with a group of like-minded individuals, we started thinking, okay, we're doing all these projects on biodiversity, projects on recycling, projects on ecofeminism, but so what? Is this really the goal? Is this the scale we want to work in? And the people in the Culture for Climate Collective have decided that it's not enough, that one more projects are only a partial goal. The overriding objective is to change the way institutions, culture institutions, operate at various levels, because the way we see an environmentally friendly culture institution involves not just reducing the use of resources, because that's a foundation, that's a starting point, and it's actually easy for many people. I mean, people are doing this, institutions are doing this, but what is more difficult, something that requires preparation, time, knowledge, and alliances, solidarity, support from the outside and inside, that's process changes and advocacy. So openly, so institutions and organizations of culture openly saying that for them climate is crucial. It's not something to address in a project, but it defines everything we do. Whether we decide not to print flyers or leaflets, or say that we care about worker relations and worker-employee rights, that it's all governed by the climate crisis, because for me it's all tied in with what Marek said. It's a social crisis, a social, political, economic crisis. It's all tied in. And the way culture can support climate movements, the way culture can support awareness, can contribute to raising awareness of what's going on, can be done in different ways, but at the moment I'm interested in processes, in long-term work with institutions, and telling ourselves what we're doing to support. Like we have a green team. Tell us how that's done. You did an environmental impact audit. How did you go about that? You want to change the structure of your institution. You want to make it more horizontal. Then how is that done? Call in experts. What experts do you work with? So that's what I'm into at the moment. this type of considerations. Individual projects, of course, are popping up, and wherever you turn in the online world or in the real world, in real life, you could, of course, go and take a look at all the projects that have been developed. But that's really going on, and but I'm shifting my attention in a different direction. I suppose that's it for the time being.
Super, też jeszcze
Okay, great, and I'm happy you mentioned
to, że się dzielicie.
the fact that you share and exchange ideas. I'll be getting back to that.
A propos tego. Dobrze, więc wstępne pytanie do Anny.
So my first question to Anna, something both Marek and Aleksandra mentioned, the climate crisis, or the term climate disaster, catastrophe, includes economic, social, democratic effects. All different types of disasters are contained within this concept. So this might be a macro question, but I like starting big and then being more specific. So how important is discussing the economy when discussing the climate? This might sound obvious, but I don't think it's something we discuss enough. Of course, there are people who think that any discussion of capitalism is inseparably tied with these issues, but there are parts where we don't discuss the economy or economics. So what do we need to make any discussion of economics and the climate one discussion? Thanks for the question. Economics, because of the system we live in, the system you mentioned, it governs, it defines the terms that condition, that shape everything we do. So this discussion is very important, and we have to ask to what extent economics as a science takes note of climate. I think that's a good question because it shows you why we're heading towards a disaster. We're heading towards disaster because economics does not notice the climate. I mean, this is a simplification. There's a whole lot of economists who do take note of the climate. But you have to remember that politics and policy and macro-scale decisions are not made by economists, but by politicians who rely on their vision of what economics does, and it's a very simplified vision. It's a vision that can be brought down to the mainstream and to a fundamental account of macro and microeconomics. So let's get it done quickly so we know what we're talking about, and that's the true disaster, because in this basic fundamental vision, climate does not exist. The environment doesn't exist. Politicians love, and I admit that so do economists, I have to admit, they love using synthetic indicators, GDP specifically, which is an indicator that defines the volume of production. And I mean, it's anybody's guess what that means. Gross domestic product simply measures industrial output. It's not a measure of development. It's not a measure of welfare, well-being. It's not a measure of quality of life. But all these three issues are measured or illustrated by GDP, but that's not what GDP is for, because it doesn't cover many aspects, environmental aspects, and very often it also falsifies, misrepresents what's happening with the environment. Let me explain. In the economy, the environment has three functions. The first and obvious, and most obvious, is to provide resources. So the environment provides resources. We mentioned the forest. So how much do we pay to log forests. Well, we don't pay to chop down forests. We pay the people who do that because that's work, but we don't pay for the timber. And much less when we log, our GDP goes up. Why does it go up? Because we pay workers to chop down the forest. That's an expenditure, and we also sell the products. We chop down, we logged the forest, and our GDP goes up. Does that make our country any richer? Not necessarily. It's rather the extent, the scope of the logging. That's important, and that's the first function, and it's simple in economic terms because it's easily monetized. We have a specific resource. The second and third functions are more tricky. We have the climate and the creation of conditions that enable a provision of services or that create. In its time, Poland wanted to grow rice. Well, that didn't work. Obviously, we do not have the natural conditions. So climate does have an important role to play. And the third function has to do with environmental services. And that's something we tend to forget. A simple example, these are all the places, all the areas around rivers, around flooding rivers, the floodplains. When a river floods its banks, they suck up the water and absorb the water without flooding houses that are close to the river. Unfortunately, as people, we've decided to interfere with nature, and sometimes we deprive ourselves of that service. So we build lovely houses and estates on the banks of rivers. The rivers flood, and there goes the lovely house. So we rebuild and we also build houses on slopes, on hills, on hillsides. To build the house, we have to chop down the forest. We have beautiful views, it's all lovely, but during the winter thaw, our house will slide down the hill with the mudslide because we don't have a forest to stop the landslide. So what happens? That's not easily calculated in monetary terms. And as economists who focus on what is monetized, we have a problem noticing that it's not on our radar. We have ways of calculating. We can calculate the losses. Okay, a house was flooded, so we can calculate the cost of reconstruction, repair, or we can calculate the cost of technology that does the job of nature, because we can build a house on a floodplain, but for that we'll need technology that's expensive. A source of information that does provide us with some information. But all the examples I've given are imperfect because they always assume that you can convert things into money value. But we can't do that. Not everything has money value, and if we do try and do that, we lose sight of different things, and it turns out that environmental services are cheaper than they actually are. So maybe that's not the way forward. Maybe we shouldn't convert everything into money and calculate or reimburse the environment. So, but even if we do, who does the money go to? Mother Nature? We can't pay Mother Nature. We could pay governments, but is that really the person the money should go to? How do we pay society? So there's a concept which is little known at the moment, the concept of transformative economics, which highlights the four key elements that need to be factored in if we're serious about ways of economically doing right by the environment or addressing the environment. And the first one is something mentioned in the first intervention. We need to highlight the value of solidarity. So it's a solidarity-based economics. Everything we do, we should remember that we're society, we're a community, we're a global community, and let's start acting that way. Let's start trying to make life better for people around the world. You have various initiatives like ethical finance, giving up speculating on food and water. You have fair trade, which was in its time a very appealing idea. We've lost. There's not that much being said about that recently, but so focusing on human needs, trying to satisfy these needs to some extent rather than chasing profit. So not individual homo economicus, but people as part of society, as social beings. That's one pillar. The second pillar of this vision are the commons, goods and services, and that gives a very interesting perspective. It's an alternative to the basic distinction we have in economics between the private and the public. So, and now you have common goods, which are neither private nor public, because it's a question of communal management, stewardship. You have a community that manages, that's responsible for common property. A lot's been written about that. There's the famous book from the 1960s, The Tragedy of the Commons. Then Elinor Ostrom, who demonstrated that it's not necessarily a tragedy, that it can be well managed, and it's an alternative. Another item in transformative, another component of transformative economics is feminist economics. What's being done there is very interesting. We need to pay more attention to those elements which are not commodified, which are not monetized, because it so happens that any activities that we define as associate with women are often unpaid. I talk about unpaid work where we spend hours working, often at the losing sleep, losing rest, or losing an opportunity to make money. But since we're working for members of our household, nobody notices. Everybody treats that as, well, something self-evident, something that's not even worth thinking about. So Adam Smith definitely didn't think about that. A few years ago, there was a book published called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? And the book clearly refers to what he wrote in The Wealth of Nations, where he says that he got his dinner from the baker, the brewer, the butcher. But we know as for a fact that it was his mother who cooked his dinner, and he doesn't mention his mother at all. So these are things that feminist economics deals with, and the role of care is important. Some people call it caring. So care cannot be converted into money. And that's an example of an imperfection of the perfection of the method where we focus too much on money. And the fourth pillar has to do with the significance of agriculture. So we'd need to reassess
sposobów produkcji
the way we produce food in the world today.
ponieważ efektywna,
Because economically efficient large-scale agriculture that isn't necessarily good for us as people,
a niektóre
and some of its elements have an impact on the climate and on the environment,
jak chociażby
like,
to takie
and this is
zdecydowane zwiększenie ilości bydła,
cattle farming.
prawda, które mamy na świecie. I twórcy tej idei
So the people behind transformative economics
są tylko 4
say that these are only 4 elements,
to jest jakbyśmy
but if we were to implement them, it would lead to a revolution in the system we have
tutaj znowu
at present, and
wskazuje
I've been pointing out the need,
przy czym ja nie wiem, czy
and I don't know if it's a revolution, an evolution,
rewolucja wprowadzana małymi
as a gradual revolution might be more effective, but I don't think we have time for that. I'm not sure we have time. Maybe we're simply out of time.
bardzo dziękuję.
Okay, thank you very much. You've
Zostało poruszone.
raised a number of interesting issues, and we'll be, I suppose, getting back to them. Now I wanted to ask
Będzie właśnie
Filip
otwarciem potem na różne
a question that might
przyszłościowe
lead to a more future-oriented discussion. Maybe we'll
do tej
be
przyszłości.
able to talk about the future in greater detail.
Zachęcam do odnoszenia
And of course, everybody's encouraged to
jakaś chęć odniesienia się, to
comment
zrobić. A
if
pytanie do
you
Filipa
want.
jest,
My
jak
question to
są
Filip
storytelling,
is how can storytelling, ecopoetics,
fotografia,
or
pisania, no,
photo literature, call it what you will, depends on how you see storytelling. So how can that create narratives about a new world,
utopijnym
a utopian world of the future, or our world?
to polemizowanie, jak to nazwać.
Depends what you want to call it.
w skali planetarnej i
Okay, so let's talk on a global scale. Before I move on to narratives,
to się zaczyna
we have to realize that it precedes a narrative because it all begins in language.
i trochę odnoszę
And
się do tytułu naszego
to get back to the title of this meeting and to what's been said already,
zaczyna się to tak w języku,
it begins in language because when using specific expressions, we define reality. We don't have to say how language defines reality. That's obvious. So if we're taking part in a meeting, with the title "Before Disaster," I have doubt we're not before,
doświadczamy, nie znaczy, że miliony ludzi
because we're not seeing this in Poland. Doesn't mean that other people, millions of people, aren't affected. If you go to the village of Piotrków Kujawski and talk to farmers there in Poland, they're affected.
ten drobiazg jakoś nam się koduje w podświadomości i później
It's a small thing that stays with us,
bardzo się
and it also connected with the dates in the title of this in this description. So the IPCC report from 2018 introduces 2 fetishized thresholds, 2030 and 2050, and that's what we use to talk about the climate crisis. It's brought it home to us because previously, before, I mean, of course,
niewiele
the report didn't change much among people who are professionally interested, but the 2018 introduced these thresholds and they mainstreamed them.
no i wcześniej w tym głównym nurcie debaty
And in the mainstream debate, previously,
te daty 2030
it was about grandchildren and children, but now with the 2030, 2050 threshold, it's become a discussion, a debate about ourselves and our children. But it's still something that's in the future. In 2030 is
też. ale jesteśmy
drawing near, so is 2050. But I mean, we personally know people who will be affected by the crisis, and that also determines the narratives. Because this might sound, our chances of meeting our great-grandchildren are less than meeting our grandchildren or children, right? So it's somebody who'll be 17 in 2030 and 37 in 2050 is different than thinking about some sort of imaginary descendant, a great-grandchild, whom we might never meet. And so seeing it that way is useful when we consider what these narratives ought to look like. Another thing that's rooted in language is seeing the subjectivity or in terms of intersectionality, and we were talking about solidarity as well. So we need to expand these concepts to include not just human beings. We need to realize that when talking about costs, about who protects whom, we need to expand that to include non-human beings, other inhabitants of this planet. So we need to stop considering things only in terms of the way they affect human beings, because that's not the case. Even if you look at the city planning and architecture, it's interesting, and it also has to do with language. It precedes a narrative. When you talk about inhuman cities, what you mean is cities where there are no non-human beings. So a city with no plant life would be inhuman. And this shows the absurdity of a situation where a city becomes human when it's inhabited by non-human beings, when there's room for them. And this is in language. This is something that's in the way we think about the diverse problems of climate. It's numerous dualisms that we've grown used to. One of the most harmful is to consider human beings independently of nature. Nature is something we can return to, but it's separate from us. We think in terms of the way we organize our time, but that's not true. We'll never be free from nature. We've never, but it was at some point necessary to believe that if we were to use the resources, we needed to cut ourselves off from nature ideologically. So these are just selected issues, and that's part of our half our curriculum at the School of Ecopoetics is about that. And we established the School of Ecopoetics. I always say we teach things that don't exist yet. These things will will be used when talking about the climate crisis, the disaster. But the climate crisis is one of the 9 ways of crossing planetary boundaries. One is the biodiversity, for instance, loss of biodiversity. These are crises like the use of freshwater use, soil use, ocean acidification. All these indicators are connected, but we have to realize that these boundaries, that if we get the climate crisis sorted, will be home free, because we have 9 more crises to deal with, serious ones. And when talking about narratives, I have to talk in terms of intuition rather than tried and tested methods. So seeing what we're experiencing in the pandemic, I think that these intuitions are accurate. So narratives have to look at conditions or what the climate crisis will cause individually, what emotions it'll produce, rather than looking at descriptions of what will happen, because what will happen is something we can't really access. We have lots of factors, mitigation strategies that we adopt, what we reduce emissions and so on. So factors that we cannot predict, anticipate, but even if we were able, left with data that we can't do anything. I mean, even if the Baltic Sea rises by 50 centimeters, then we can fiddle with the controls and see which parts of Poland will be flooded. But this really doesn't, of the coast, because this really doesn't tell us much. We can take measures, we can take steps, and it really doesn't tell us anything about the reality we'll end up in. But if we say that in Warsaw, the climate will be as like it is in Tbilisi in 2050, if nothing changes, then we can say that about 30 men, 60 and over, will die owing to heat waves. That's the forecasts. But that really doesn't tell us a lot in narrative terms. We can, however, think what the pandemic did to us. So what the pandemic did is that we're more concerned about our loved ones, or we're mourning the loved ones whom we've lost. We've lost, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I've lost faith and trust and confidence in the state, in its ability to deal with crisis. On the contrary, I'm becoming mistrustful of the state. I'm afraid that the state will, as Bruno Latour, move towards a new climate regime, clamping down on dissent, democracy, and reinforcing, consolidating the position of the privileged, letting them exploit people. So we'll desperately look for community, and the state will not help us in that. We'll try and look at our environment, not in terms of whether it provides the best possibility for development and personal growth, but whether it allows us to survive a given crisis, like what happens if supply chains are broken, or if there's a blackout or a hurricane. And these are all emotions that we've been experiencing on a micro scale during the pandemic. And we can try and talk about the planetary crisis by referring to these emotions. And this is where the power of literature comes in, insight into personal experience. And this is the way we need to head, but we have to take into account solidarity that includes not just human beings, and also the subjectivity of other beings. So we're part of a larger system, and here I think that speculative fiction can be very helpful. It's worth reading if we are to learn anything and find a way out of the dead end we're in.
Bardzo dziękuję. Tak.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that was a very important comment you made about the before the climate crisis, the before the disaster. That's something we mentioned yesterday during the debate. The question of individual hope. So we know that the crisis is inevitable, or at least all of us, I think, know that it is, but that there's still a sliver of hope, some hope that we can stop it to some degree. Let me just cut in. This is happening here and now. I think we can all agree how bad, it's a question of how bad things will be and not whether things will be bad. Rebecca Solnit in Hope in the Dark puts it very well when she says that we don't know what effects our actions will bring, but all we can do is act and see what happens. Because if we don't, then we know things will be terrible and very, very bad. However, we need to avoid more of a pessimist, just to make it clear, like the previous speakers, like the other panelists. There's a huge challenge facing us, and considering how we've been dealing with the pandemic, where we have one factor a factor we can eliminate in a predictable time frame. It might be inconvenient as a time frame if we have to wait another year, but still, that's a short time frame. It's not a lot. It's not when we see it in terms of the problems of climate crisis, all these factors, many of which we don't know, some of which don't have a remedy. Then looking at the way we've been dealing with this micro crisis, the pandemic, then I kind of lose hope. But it's not a foregone conclusion. I mean, it's not really. And is any apocalyptic takes on climate crisis is like a new denialism. So the old denialism, saying that it's nothing serious, are actually only crackpots are saying that. I mean, they're still loud, but they're no longer relevant. The fact that volcanoes have always erupted. But the denialism that says that it's all bad and nothing can be done, that's more dangerous.
Dziękuję bardzo. Jeśli ktoś jeszcze chciałby się odnieść też do tej pierwszej rundy pytań.
Thank you very much. If anybody else wants to comment on this first round of questions, if anything inspired you, then let us know, because perhaps there's something we could explore further. If not, then I'll move on to my next set of questions.
O których Filip mówił.
And getting back to the emotions that Philip mentioned, and the fact that facts are not enough to make up a narrative,
Mam pytanie do
because you also need an emotional dimension component.
kultury.
I have a question to Aleksandra Ola, who is not just involved in culture, but she also builds communities and emotions. I have a question because you said a lot about exchange that's going on, exchange between culture institutions and various collectives. So how do you bring together people in groups, because you can have individuals and groups, to build shared narratives? Or to debate these, discuss these narratives that would be based on empathy and deep listening, truly listening to one another. So not just exchanging facts and words, but something that has more empathy to it. Well, that's the main task as I see it. My sense of what I can do about the climate crisis, that's really crucial. And it actually brought me to Culture for Climate, and it led me to support groups and individuals in their development, to help them understand each other. It's a path. Well, personally,
jakby ja po sobie widzę, co ze mną się wydarzyło, nie? Mentalnie.
And I see what happened to me mentally and where I am now, following my fascination with facts, the Anthropocene, these planetary concepts and this discourse on a planetary scale. I spent a long time exploring that. The next step was when I got into smaller, more small-scale issues, ecofeminism, political ecology. There's a lot of that around, and I'm a little irritated talking about it because precisely of how much of it there is. We know so much, but what do we do next? What can we do? And the breakthrough for me came, it was 2 years ago. There was this initiative, the Anti-Fascist Year, where culture institutions and individuals came together to discuss how we can talk about anti-fascism today.
Znaczy już trudny. Też nie chcę w to...
And it was a difficult period in Poland. I don't want to get into that because it depresses me. But things were difficult at Muzeum Sztuki. We were wondering what to do.
Kolejnej wystawy na ten temat.
So we had this idea where we didn't want to do another exhibition to wallow in the past because that would make us even more depressed. So what can we do? What we did was something we called a Congress of Empathy. We brought together people who support others in their development, who help develop a language of empathy, but the practice of empathy is more important. The language of empathy without compassion, without experience, is just an instrument.
I to, co się później zadziało właśnie w kontekście kultury.
And what happened next in the context of Culture for Climate was building alliances, building of a larger movement in culture, I hope, that deals with climate. It was based on working with structures, organizations, and that's our collective, which is horizontal. Various things we're doing in education and training. And that's what they're about. They're about sharing know-how about how to build horizontal structures, how to learn a language that's... There's something called non-violent understanding. It's a communication. It's a language that helps us relate, connect to people, and help us understand each other's needs and establish relations or understand relations that can be difficult.
I dla mnie to jest jakieś takie centrum moich zainteresowań, nie? Więc...
And that's at the core of my interests.
No tak. Dzięki.
Dzięki wielkie. To teraz...
Thanks a lot.
Schodzić na mikropytania. Może to jest rzecz, której się...
I don't think I can ask micro questions or discuss micro issues. Maybe one day I will. It's somehow big questions come easier to me. Anyway, getting back to economy, getting back to economics, because solidarity, economics, empathy, it's all connected. And it's interesting that these various facts based on data about the climate, economic data, that doesn't have an emotional component usually. That doesn't grow out of community thinking, but it's more statistics and data, but they should be included in this narrative. My question to Anna is how can we use utopian thinking? How can new narratives, the new language that Philip mentioned, be applied to discussions about economics in transformative, feminist economics that you mentioned? How can it become part of a language narrative that's a component of utopian social thinking? How can, because I think economics is something that's difficult to discuss, especially economics of the future or forward-looking. Thank you very much. And it's like you mentioned, And it also, and Philip also referred to language. Language is very important. I have to say that some concepts that come up, some concepts are difficult to accept by economists, but we are using these terms and concepts, and perhaps they'll contribute to the change. There's a concept that's put forward by feminist economists, and recently I've read that it's our word, in fact. Other schools of economics don't use this term. I'm referring to unpaid work. It's not just feminists who talk about unpaid work, but other schools talk about social reproduction. And when we call it social reproduction, we lose sight of the fact that somebody actually works to make that reproduction possible, so it becomes more abstract. And so you need to use language, you need to hope that it will bring about a change. There's one more thing, and it's perhaps the least utopian vision among the visions of the future that I'm aware of, one that might bring about real change. The point is to make the invisible visible. And I'm talking about economics now, because economics is blind. It fails to notice unpaid work, it fails to notice the environment and climate. So if we do this work and reveal what had been ignored up until now, perhaps unconsciously, but it was simply not part of the equation, so that would be a step forward. And feminists in their time said that the private is political. Now we can say that the invisible is also political. But it's far more difficult to notice because we're socialized in such a way as not to notice it. And I think that this step is the first necessary step that we have to take, and perhaps it's not very complicated once we've found these invisible things, but we have a list of invisible things, and the next step is far more difficult. Namely, these invisible things should be placed at the center of the discipline. So economics would no longer be about production, the exchange of goods, the monetary exchange. It would be about air, the environment, social well-being, the quality of life. And that's far more difficult, because it's one thing to name things, to discover, to say that somewhere on the margins of our discipline, these issues can be considered, but placing them in the center of the discipline and saying that this is the center of our world today, and everything else should revolve around that, is far more difficult, if not impossible. And there's one more element that's also very difficult, which I've mentioned already during this debate, namely the significance of money. Because, well, money can't be overestimated, its significance. In the world today, we're dependent on money. We simply can't function without money. For instance, unpaid care that's provided in a household, can be provided because we have income. The household has monetary income. Without money, in the contemporary capitalist world in Poland, we can't provide this here. So the basics of our life and survival are based on money. But money is an element that's at the core of our thinking, of our consciousness. And that's regrettable. It's been going on for decades. I'll quote Veblen. Veblen 100 years ago, at the turn of the century, wrote that if somebody asks how much another person is worth, they usually mean how much that person makes. And that's exactly how we define the worth of people, based on how much they make, based on their money value. We have lists, we have ranking, we rank people according to how much they make. But as Polanyi, among others, said, money and the market, that's just one of the possibilities, of the possible ways of exchanging or transferring goods and services in society. If we were to ask someone in the street how these transfers of bread might be achieved, the answer would be obvious. Okay, I can go to the shop and buy some bread, or go to the bakery. But you also have two other ways. The first is communal. We elect an authority, and that authority distributes what society produced. It's called redistribution. And it's based, democratic elections today are believed to be the best mechanism there is. And it's difficult to conceive, to imagine that an authoritarian regime determines how much bread I get. But this has come up before, how much we need to ensure that these are community-based solutions. Community-based solutions often involve delegating power. And I wanted to point that out. We need to see the redistribution of power. We do make choices, of course, but we all should have the ability to influence the outcome of these elections. And another way is giving gifts. We can gift one another goods and services. And here, the element that makes a gift is reciprocity. If we give someone something, if we gift something to someone, then there is this expectation that the gift will be reciprocated, not necessarily today. It could be in years. And when we're giving gifts, as Polanyi wrote, gifts can be given back to other people. This reciprocity can be intergenerational. So if I give my children my care, then the idea is that one day they'll pass that care on. It could be, they could care for me, but someone else, like their children. And these are three models of social integration, because the market also integrates a society, but that works differently. Each of these methods works differently. Polanyi, half a century ago, wrote that the ideal situation is when this is all balanced, when, as a society, we can use all these methods in a balanced way. But in contemporary capitalism, It's not ballast. The primacy of money means that we live differently. Instead of cohesion, we are alienated individuals. And as we are alienated individuals, and we believe what we read in textbooks of economics that say that everyone should maximize their own benefit, that'll lead us to disaster. And we need to change that. How? Quickly. Because that's the only... I think the first step would be to make the invisible visible and convince everyone that it's important. Thank you very much for this contribution. Okay, moving along with the big questions. We have 20 minutes left. I don't see any questions from our viewers on Facebook, so let's have 7 minutes each from Filip and Marek.
Leży mi jakieś takie pytanie, bo odnosimy się do bardzo...
There's a question I have. We've been talking about very important, very beautiful, very relevant things when thinking about the future: solidarity, care, changing economics, changing culture, changing language. And all these things exist, come up in thinking and also in action. My question to Marek is, how can we combine these various elements? And if we combine them in action, what do we want to see? What do we want to happen after the year 2050? Okay, I realize that's a big question, given that you have 5 minutes to answer. But if we, all these actions, where can they take us? The threshold of 2050, 30 years from now, that's a lot in terms of individual existence, but it's very little. In terms of the rate of change. And here I'd be a moderate optimist. That's the way I'd put it. I believe that we might develop ways of fixing the world, but I don't believe that the world can be fixed for good once and for all. I'm not an optimistic idiot, or at least I hope I'm not. I think there are a couple of things that can be done. I start by saying that one of the most misleading questions we have today is what to do. Because after thousands of discussions, hundreds of books and experts, we know roughly what should be done in various areas regarding various issues. So, but the question, everybody asking what should be done, decision makers, experts, and politicians, and in the media, by asking the question, people hide the fact that nobody really wants to think how to do what we know has to be done. How to do the things we know have to be done. There's a whole bunch of simple things that we could start to get the ball rolling. It's not a big intellectual problem to launch processes of making democracy more democratic, We all know how that should be done. There was a lot written about that, a very interesting book, which gives full insight how this can be achieved, is Pierre Rosanvallon's Good Governance. It's a book on how to create institutions at various levels under the watchful eye of citizens, of individuals, and introduce that, make that part of practice of governance. There are discussions on how to give people freedom to act, to be involved. People are willingly involved if they have the time. So one way of doing this would be universal basic income. There was a book by Guy Standing published about that recently. And so there are fairly simple logistic solutions that can be done, at least in our small world in Europe, in order to create paths or possibility approaches that others might adopt. Getting back to economics and feminist economics specifically, I think it could be expanded. Greber, for instance, wrote about goods of common concern, commons, various micro engagements, micro engagement in improving, in making the world around you better through social activism in culture and in various other areas. The actions which are usually referred to as volunteering or social activism should be present because they fix, they make small worlds better, and by creating a network of improvement, they make the world a better place. When thinking about a new development model, that's something we should definitely take into include. We should take into account. We should get rid of the misconception that democracy can be cheap. This is a misconception that arose in the 1970s with the emergence of neo-liberalism. But now democracy has to be expensive, costly, and the agency and effectiveness of democracy should also be seen as a part of the social measure of development. So it's easy to realize that culture can be an instrument of cultural, of social change. I'm saying this in Teatr Powszechny, which applies this in practice. Productions by this theater have affected the social awareness in various ways. But culture is broader than that, and thinking about culture, about access to common goods, to one of the fundamental social goods, and by encouraging the development of this good, works of culture with a view to making the world a better place and dealing with the climate crisis, that's nothing exceptional. And everybody knows that, we know that in the next decade or next decades, it would be easy to change our eating habits. You could easily introduce a tax on environmentally harmful production and support those industries which are beneficial, which are environmentally friendly. We can go for eco-mobility, do away with harmful transport and eco-construction. So there are a number of industries where you can easily start changing the world, as long as This change will be motivated by the awareness that the change is necessary, but also by the fact that we're all in this together, that it's that we all, as I said before, that we all depend on one another, so we can't just save ourselves. We have to save everybody else. And that's not a moral directive, perhaps, because it might be difficult to emotionally accept that everybody else needs helping, but it's a cognitive imperative. It's something we ought to remember. Okay, thank you very much. And now for the last question, which might be the most abstract or the broadest question, I'm addressing it to Philip.
Gdzieś już wspomniana ta utopia wcześniej tutaj.
We've mentioned utopia, and I think that the title of the forum, Solidarity and Care, in itself contains an element of utopia, which all ties in with solidarity and care.
Myślenie utopijne.
How can you use utopian thinking? And this might serve as a summary of things we've said. So how can utopian thinking, how can we think about utopia to create a vision of action, an action plan? Can we move from utopian thinking to action in the future?
No to tak, i 6 minut.
And I have 6 minutes to answer that.
Da się, ale bym nie przeceniał. To znaczy,
It is possible, but I wouldn't overestimate that. We've fallen in love, I think, with this diagnosis.
że
Julia Fiedorczuk would probably give a footnote
kultura przyzwyczaiła od pewnego momentu
here. So, but pop culture at some point has made us used to mistrusting utopia. This has to do with 20th century utopias, which all ended badly. And today we need utopias so much, but I feel that the word utopia is fraught with mistrust, that the 20th century utopias might have convinced us that any utopia will inevitably lead to a dystopia. So I'd be cautious here. I'm thinking of a book that I'm working on at the moment. It's for a text I'm writing, and it shows what happens if you think or fiddle with utopias constructively. It's Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, a wonderful science fiction book, two planets, one of which is exactly like Earth. But this planet is fortunate enough to have another planet, Anaris, which is habitable. So you have a classic outsourcing of revolution. Everybody who doesn't accept, who objects to the system on the Earth planet, they get 12 spaceships and they're sent to this planet to build their utopia. And this utopia is built around what we've been talking about. The culture of redistribution, gifting, direct democracy. They have something like civic panels as the ruling body. They have no money. And money doesn't determine relations between people. And what's interesting in the book, and something that shows us how you can use utopia to deal with the challenges facing us. This utopia, this wonderful planet where all the revolutionaries moved. So you have internal conflict, and there is a degeneration that sets in. But there's a response to this process. So a utopia is not a state that you achieve, but it's a process that's fluctuating, that changes, that requires work. And commons are also not given once and for all, but they're things that require work, things you have to build. For me, as somebody who works with narratives, who writes stories, what's most interesting about this is that there's an internal conflict which is the basic plot element of the plot. I'm not talking about the utility of the system, I'm talking in purely literary terms. It's not naive in any way. I mean, although it is. It was written in the early 70s in the States, so it does see certain things that they didn't experience, but we did at the time. I mean, not me personally, but this part of Europe. In that sense, the book gives us a hint how to treat utopia, but wary, I'm loath to use the word, because the word again has this ballast, and we are rightly mistrustful. Now, to comment on what you said about there being no need to call it a utopia, and getting back to these new languages, new ideas that are seeping in to economics. Economics, as we understand it today, and the laws, the rules it's governed by, shouldn't also encroach on other areas of life. This is difficult. As the organizer of a festival, and this will be about culture, when I say that I don't want my Janka Fest to expand, to become bigger, to have a bigger, more extensive program, and to have a bigger audience, I often, there's a radical response by the audience who say that growth expansion is a measure of success, but instead I want to downsize, to wind down the festival, if only, for instance, due to its carbon footprint. But growth is not something I want. I'm looking for growth as we understand it today, but there's opposition, there's resistance I meet. An example often given by Julia Fiedorczuk, an example I love, is that poetry is exempt from this language. As a creative activity, poetry has so little to do with the market. I mean, we know, maybe 3 people in this country are able to make a living writing the poetry, but most poets don't make a living. So since it's not governed by market forces, it's free. It's free also from the ways of telling us about the world, and therefore it becomes a space where we can communicate outside these norms, and there's a whole field, a whole range, and thanks to Marek Beylin for saying that we don't have to think what to do, we have to start acting. So it does give an possibility for action that's free of these considerations, and I don't see this in utopian terms. There's a wonderful book by Julia Fiedorczuk, Other Possibilities, where she asks American poets whether they can save the world, whether poetry will save the world, and they're all very outraged and say that yes, of course, poetry will save the world, and I like that very much. Thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot of interesting ground, and even though many of you have said that it's not optimistic, I think that, well, it was all definitely positive, and thanks for all these contributions.
przynajmniej dla mnie. Nie wiem, jak wszyscy.
I think it motivated us, me, definitely, it motivated me.
Jak różne rzeczy
Think about how things are intermesh, how it's all connected,
mogą wpływać do tego, żeby jakoś
and how these various steps
nawzajem jakieś
we
wspólne
can
działania,
take
które może
can
nie są oczywiste albo może nie są
lead us to
Więc
common
bardzo wam dziękuję.
collective action that's perhaps not self-evident and something we don't often think about. So thanks very much. That's it for the day. And let me just tell our viewers on Facebook that at 5 p.m., if I'm not wrong, there's another debate, the last debate of this forum. Thank you all very much.